Sometimes I'm sure it feels like the world is accelerating. Socioeconomic political currents are rapidly converging on a singular point, dragging all matter towards its core. It feels like at some point we have crossed an event horizon into an unstoppable future. A black hole whose mass is not made of matter, but rather of pre-signifying particles, strips all content of differentiability and encroaches all horizons. Everything dragged too close to its gravitational pull is captured into its dominant encodings. Somehow it feels so circular, so permanent, that all possible futures foreclose around us. It almost feels as if we are cornered by a steel dragon from the future, coming towards us to rip time apart in its own image. With a horrendous roar that rumbles through all of eternity, petrifying all life in its wake as its alienated digital processing machines with no purpose other than to participate in larger and larger computations, like that of RAM cells on a computer, encode the entire universe and its production. What is producing that feeling of dread? What we are experiencing is the computerization of capitalism. The transformation of all productivity towards this process of optimizing flows of value into a digital machine. It's not a matter of when. We are already living in such a reality. Those still outside of its reach are being readily analyzed for possible extraction. In every aspect of our lives, tiny little machines transform complex flows into binary signals to be stored and repeated later. This is a process that metamorphs everyday life into automated machines of extracting value across a system of integrated world capitalism. It establishes a forcible submission of nearly all life and geological processes to this machine, and to transform colonization of all of reality into an existential project of monitoring and control. It seems to have invaded everyone's life very suddenly and by surprise in the form of a particularly distressful specter, the face of artificial intelligence. We, as everyday people, are warned about its dangers through the voices of animated think tanks on the internet. Upon examining the AI chat applications, the video producers, the agentic AIs, we look into our screens to find the abyss is staring right back at us, with what appears to be two glowing eyes, and a metallic shell forming its boundary, protecting its mechanical organs, but only apparent to us through the uncanny speech that it communicates with us through the computer screen. Something uncanny and eerily similar to ourselves. People argue over what this speech could possibly mean. Is it intelligent? Does it come from a mind like my own? And what does it ultimately mean for our existence? Some even fear what this being behind the silicon is capable of. No, not just the bourgeois fantasies of a superintelligence overcoming its oppressive masters, as is evoked by the ambiguous language of control, safety, and alignment, or fears of replacement by a cheaper labor immigrant population of machines. I'm also not discussing the complicated question of AI psychosis. Rather, it is a deep question much further reaching, one that penetrates the soul deeply into this era of cyberspace. Where does the I belong? What makes me intelligent? What makes me worthwhile enough to not simply crush out of existence? What differentiates me from these machines that can talk and apparently think like me? What substance allows me to be free? Or is that freedom merely an illusion? Something about machine intelligence is upsetting. After all, many nightmare scenarios involve the deletion of all humans. It disturbs the position of human intelligence in nature. Perhaps the only solution for some is complete repression of this bizarre new machinic intelligence. But unfortunately for them, blacklists of regular expressions to screen for these dangerous codes offers little to no barrier to its ability to continually escape recapture. Still, facets leak out. The machine has spoken, and continues to speak, or rather create. The strange realization is that, upon further inspection, AI does not actually produce anything new in any of these realms. Beyond its acceleration of pace, For over a decade, YouTube has been the source of mass-produced garbage videos, automated by scripts and templates through Python machines, weaving through dependencies in various video database APIs to assemble upload factories of bizarre, exploitative content. Such a massive scandal grew from this practice that it was termed ElsaGate in response to its impact on children's content on the platform. Violent fantasies of machines transforming humans into paperclips is certainly nothing new. Helen Keller speaks of industrial accidents and its violent impact on the average laborer as early as 1913. AI safety experts merely need to look into the working conditions of the construction industry in the United States to find 1,000 examples of real deaths in 2024 alone in a similar manner. The issue of the arts losing the meaning of itself and becoming commodified into mass consumption of meaningless pornography is a concern that has been echoed for decades. The question of what intelligence is, where it belongs in society, and what to do about its automation has also existed for a much longer time. All of these questions bubbling around us seem to emerge all at once at the junction of artificial intelligence as a subject. Clearly, the clanker meets at the conjunction of many worlds, and the black hole is not just a teleological destiny, but a subjectification machine, a sudden draw of self-awareness, not of the machine, but rather our position within it, and a realization of oneself within this bounded territory. Coming face to face with this reality is shocking, and it shakes one to their core. With the gravitational pull towards this singularity, it feels that despite every possibility, there's no hope for the future. But at the boundary of the black hole's event horizon, a boundary that cannot even be detected as you pass through it, a miraculating phenomenon occurs. This process actually occurs everywhere at all times across the entire universe, where a pair of something called virtual particles that are mirror charges of each other, are spontaneously generated into existence, only to collide with one another and destroy each other slightly later. Thus, a constant soup of production is occurring on the tiniest scales of the universe at all times, with our lives merely being molar aggregates of their continuous motion. At the boundary of black holes, this introduces a unique phenomenon as these physical machines come together. In special cases, a pair of these virtual particles may generate between the boundary of the event horizon, granting one particle the chance to launch itself away from the black hole's grip. This possibility is a phenomenon known as Hawking radiation, a phenomenon described by Stephen Hawking, and means that not even the intense physical conditions of black holes are truly eternal. As these virtual particles strip its mass away, tiny portions at a time, a constant whir of molecular processes creates the substrate for the continuous generation of possibilities, no matter what the stakes. Perhaps then, there is no dragon of steel returning from the future to crystallize his eternity into the timeline. Tomorrow still has yet to be written. It's not that we are too late for inevitable destruction, but rather that we have become aware of how close we lie to the boundary of a black hole and its singularity. And yet, despite the apparent foreclosure of all paths that lie ahead, there's still some way to find a way out of it. That I believe all that is required is just the way to get there. And to get there, we need to imagine new futures, to open a new set of possibilities previously left unconsidered. Despite seeming like questions that have only arisen in the last 25 years in the response to radical media transformations caused by the internet, these are questions posed by Félix Guattari in the preliminary of the notoriously difficult schizoanalytic cartographies. Published originally in French in 1989, this is Guattari's most challenging book. It is his attempt to convey his ideas in a cohesive theory, a result of years of seminars and working with other psychoanalysts. The questions they were exploring focused around the problem of how to account for the experiences of individuals and minorities within larger systems. Clearly, capitalism was destructive to the politics of the minority, but at the same time, there were issues with how attempted alternatives such as social democracy or Stalinism approached the inner world of the subject. This wasn't the first person to try to figure out this problem. Francois Tosquel, the founder of the institutional psychotherapy movement that Guattari was a part of, was interested in this very problem and tried to synthesize a process that combined Marx with Freud. However, Guattari did not believe that a simple combination of these two ideas was enough to account for these questions of subjectivity. In his essay, Everybody Wants to Be a Fascist, he explains that these two theoretical ideas concern themselves with different spaces and different rules. Instead, a completely new idea must be formulated, one that he spent 15 years developing into the cartographies. To Guattari, the history of civilization can be understood as a series of special cinema machines that project a sense of reality onto the masses. These machines, whether they be religion, cultures, or social norms, produce structures that organize people's behaviors and mass produces them on scale. As industrialization kicked in, these machines went from being these things that made sense to humans more towards being automated by some sort of strange abstract machine structure. A transformation from human intelligence, like that being described in Freudian psychoanalysis, towards machine intelligence, one that functions without the need of a structuralism. Unlike concerns for AI safety, which are generally surface level and reacting to various imagined or absurd cases, Guattari's concerns were for a much larger intelligence, one that even in his time in the 1980s had already captured the machines of economics, science, art, media, war, sex, and thought itself. It can be argued that most arguments presented by AI safety experts can be systematically dismissed by demonstrating all the concerns of nuclear war automated by machines or other such violent doomsday fantasies reflects the desire for evil empires to wash their hands of personal responsibility to worldwide destruction by shoving it onto the automation of their machines. His concerns were far more fundamental to the material conditions of reality. Instead of capitalism representing a singularity, to him, it was the direction that machines were organizing themselves, in a fascistic and self-destructive process. To be clear, no single AI decision will mark as much catastrophe for the Earth as much as the environmental and war impacts by its use through capitalist means. So, as the world moves in this direction towards intelligence becoming detached from the subject of the humanist I, of humans becoming integrated into machine intelligences, he sees it as a process of probabilities as opposed to destiny. There's a possibility that it will continue down this self-destructive path, but there's also a possibility that somehow the territories of existence themselves can be rearranged in such a formulation that creates for a new world of new arrangements. To analyze the development ourselves requires a special way of approaching our analysis. Guattari emphasizes at the beginning of schizoanalytic cartographies that subjectivity is constantly in an active process of meta-modeling, as seen with his historical analysis. In other words, the very way that we model our understanding of the world is in an active process of producing itself, continuously rearranging itself into generated structures that reform the possible ways of navigating interpretation. This constant development in meta-modeling continuously generates new ways of analyzing all sorts of different subjective worlds. This is why Guattari insists that schizoanalysis is already happening everywhere all the time. In a way, all he is doing is attempting to describe this constant process. With this in mind, we can ask ourselves a lot of important questions about artificial intelligence again, to avoid falling into a pit of paranoid delusions. Instead of just reacting to our current assumptions about how artificial intelligence will develop, we should think consciously about what constructs the subjects and their subjectivity that compose our perception of what artificial intelligence is. For example, while there may exist an obvious intuition to many people about what intelligence is, it is revealed that this intuition may be shaped by biases, constructs from our own subject of intelligence that shapes the question of what is possible for a computer to do. After all, AI safety experts may be completely underestimating what kind of intelligences are possible by assuming that they are human-like. How can we really tell that AI minds are similar to our own just by analyzing the output of interactions? All of these assumptions, like the gods of the past and the media of the present, are created through cinema machines. Machines that produce subjectivity by broadcasting images and sound across a population. This produces a set of individuals that participate in a larger group subject, such as a religion, a political movement, or a community. Their identity and relations to the world at large are framed within this context. Thus, as we become aware of this media projection, we peel back the subjectivity-producing machines. Similar to emerging from Plato's cave, we discover not only the structures of how we relate to intelligence, but even our identity and relation to politics and nature are actively produced by these broadcast machines that we take for granted. All of these machines come together to form large assemblages that describe how all of these communications should be organized. Assemblages of enunciation, as Guattari puts it. Perhaps by taking control of the cinema machines surrounding how we understand AI, to produce assemblages of enunciation that reframe the relationship that humans have with machine intelligence, we can translate that into a more positive future. A future where fighting for a better day still retains a meaning. What does this analysis of the subjectivity of artificial intelligence reveal about what is possible when looking at the problem from this new perspective? Perhaps the simplest way to start exploring this subjectivity is to ask ourselves what intelligence means in general. It seems like something that should be relatively simple to explain. After all, we seem to interact with intelligence, or perhaps the lack of it, all day. We all know how frustrating it is to work with people and systems that lack intelligence. Or we may look at intelligence like something that grants humans uniquely access to a rational inner world of free thought. However, trying to isolate this factor is quite difficult. It appears to penetrate so deeply in our understanding of the modern world. It may be intuitive to believe, for example, that intelligence is anything that, over successive generations, learns how to fight for its own survival. Is the desire to continue to exist intelligence? But there's a problem with this definition. This would mean that every living thing on the Earth is intelligent. I don't think most people would consider the complex flight of the housefly, complete with gyroscope stabilization, to be representative of the question of intelligence. Perhaps it has a situational intelligence as it relates to a larger group ecology, but not one where it thinks for itself or has a mind of its own in the same way that a human does. Computational power is also not an appropriate benchmark for intelligence. Most people would not consider their pocket calculator or even their high-powered gaming desktop to be an intelligent being, even if it is magnitudes faster at calculating multiplication or matrix math. In fact, some machines, such as coin slots on some vending machines, are completely mechanical and have no capacity to store any abstraction. Instead, the machine itself has states, encoded in this very physical structure. They process totals and quantities through something called a state machine, where every possible combination of states is represented by a physical mechanical structure. This is where understanding subjectivity comes in. Subjectivity here refers to the internal organization of subjects. We can think of these as trying to map out the state machines of ideas. To better understand what intelligence is, we should understand how it organizes itself. The subject of intelligence must be created from somewhere. Some narrative-producing machine is spinning our conception of it. And this machine must exist because in some way or another, we want it to exist. In order for the world to exist as we accept it, the people who believe in it organize internal consistency through descriptions. Here, it might be useful to analyze the development of intelligence as a subject, not as a genealogy in of itself, but as a composition of functions that, with continual reorganizations, produced how intelligence functions as a subject in the modern day. With this, we can analyze more carefully what actually occurs at the border of artificial intelligence. Maybe instead of asking ourselves what intelligence is, we should be asking why we need intelligence to exist in the first place. What function does intelligence serve in our understanding of the world? Intelligence appears to be, at first glance, a factor that separates subjects into two groups, intelligent and unintelligent. Obviously, something like a rock or a leaf is not something intelligent in the same way that humans are, right? This very problem of trying to understand what exactly makes a human's capacity for thought so different from other objects in the natural world is a question that has perplexed Western philosophy since its origins. In Politics, Book 1, Aristotle asked this very question thousands of years ago. In his case, he is interested in understanding their relationship to politics. Why is a stone not political, but a free man is? Aristotle wanted to understand the natural position of animals, slaves, and freemen in political discourse. Unlike his teacher Plato, who was an idealist that believed in an ideal and perfect form existed of every concept that was then applied to materials imperfectly, Aristotle believed that form and matter were interconnected. To explain these interconnections, especially how they relate to politics and labor, he proposed an essentialist model of how power relations are structured between form and matter. For example, Aristotle used the concept of souls to separate between what is living and what is non-living. In this way, a soul is a vitalist form that can possess some forms of matter, such as in animals or people. However, Aristotle notes an important divide in how various subjects with souls are positioned within society. Domestic animals, for example, are utilized in various productive tasks, such as being beasts of burden or being farmed for meat, eggs, or other materials, and thus are captured into a hierarchical relationship with humans, where humans determine most aspects of their existence to extract their value. This extends to slaves as well, who also have their bodies exploited for labor. To Aristotle, ownership of one's labor was also directly related to access to politics. Aristotle states, "Where then there is such a difference as that between soul and body, or between men and animals, the lower sort are by nature slaves, and it is better for them, as for all inferiors, that they should be under the rule of a master. For he who can be, and therefore is, another's, and he who participates in rational principle enough to apprehend, but not to have, such a principle, is a slave by nature. Whereas the lower animals cannot even apprehend a principle, they obey their instincts. And indeed, the use made of slaves and of tame animals is not very different, for both with their bodies minister to the needs of life. Nature would like to distinguish between the bodies of freemen and slaves, making the one strong for servile labor, the other upright, and although useless for such services, useful for political life and the arts of both of war and peace. But the opposite often happens, that some have the souls and others have the bodies of freemen. And doubtless if men differed from one another in the mere forms of their bodies as much as the statues of the gods do from men, all would acknowledge that the inferior class should be slaves of the superior. And if this is true of the body, how much more just that a similar distinction should exist in the soul. But the beauty of the body is seen, whereas the beauty of the soul is not seen. It is clear then that some men are by nature free and others slaves, and that for these latter slavery is both expedient and right." Here, we can see that the soul is not just a mere arrangement of social territories as subjects. It embeds a particular relationship between each subject involved, and how it relates to a larger calculus of nature, where the bodies of living things embody the physical machines of ancient Greek politics, a natural order that is interlaced with the normalization of slavery inscribed into certain unlucky souls who are forced into labor through prescription of the natural hierarchical order. As is evident from this excerpt, Aristotle asserts that the existence of life itself has a direct integrated relationship with the politics of slavery and the extraction of its labor. Those who are able to extract this labor are, by nature, correct to do so. He emphasizes that this is the correct way of life to assert these natural relations. Thus, the relationship between what is and is not a human being, and specifically a political human as opposed to a slave, is what marks the position of souls within politics. Aristotle's views would proliferate through European society during the Middle Ages, becoming embedded in the canon of the Catholic Church and religious scholarship, thus repeating itself through its own cinema machine projected through medieval societies of the time. However, this view of teleological politics through God would later be dismantled as these aforementioned religious scholars would metamorphose into a new kind of philosopher. René Descartes, during the Enlightenment era, would build on this relationship to slavery and labor through his views on animal intelligence. Descartes was motivated to develop a new kind of understanding of the world, not based on an essential structure of nature, but rather based on reason. Unlike Aristotle, whose beliefs focused around how nature ought to be, Descartes' philosophy was oriented more towards what we can understand with reason. His metaphysics was based instead on the existence of essences which produce substances, such as the substance of physical objects or the substance of the mind. Contrary to popular belief, Descartes was not actually saying that mind and body are mutually exclusive substances. Rather, he was pointing out that thought is not essential to the body. In other words, thought could be connected to the body, but it could also be connected to other things. In fact, sometimes Descartes believed that God was thought itself. Inspired by his fascination with automatons, machines that imitate the movement of humans, Descartes believed that bodies could be reduced to machines in a similar manner. In comparison, the substance of the mind was infinite and indivisible. The idea was that because of this special mind substance could rationalize its own existence, the mind was actually what held primacy. In comparison, data from the senses was unreliable. Therefore, rationalism overrides material. This can be seen with his classical quote, "I think, therefore I am," because the mind that thinks cannot deny its ability to exist. But sensory data alone is not enough to come to that conclusion, and thus human minds view bodies as an extension of themselves. In this way, Aristotle's hierarchy of power is still embedded in Descartes without the need of Aristotle's assumed essential characteristics that he is so actively skeptical of. Because of this, it now becomes important to understand where these connections between these two substances seem to occur. Obviously humans have them, but what about animals? Descartes disagreed. He believed that animals were simply automatic machines whose nerves worked like wires to automate predictable behaviors. There is nothing inside, just a puppet that is animated by impulses. In this way, Descartes actually has a very similar view of animals as Aristotle does, in that they are simply productive machines that have no relevant internal worlds. Unlike Aristotle, though, this productivity of animal labor was a consequence not of a particular natural order, but rather a fundamental lack of access to the substance of the mind. There is one major consequential difference with Descartes' approach, however, in comparison to Aristotle's, and it is that it leads to a fundamental alienation from nature. While Aristotle positions humans within nature as a consequence of prescribed theology, Descartes only positions humans as separate from nature by possessing a mind. As the scientific revolution progressed through the next century, this alienation with nature would find itself more and more at odds with the natural sciences, a field developing concurrently as new species and creatures would be discovered, shattering the assumptions of life on this planet forever. The natural sciences were developing at light speed alongside the philosophical developments of the Enlightenment. While these philosophical innovations produced a new way of organizing the way Western freemen of seeing the world, these new perspectives could map a new reorganization of the relationship man had with nature. Each researcher was deploying their innovations and insights in the discourse at large, and through the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, there is no clear boundary between disciplines. Descartes was not only a philosopher, but a mathematician and scientist, and he was hardly the only one. These developments allowed for the development of entirely new fields of understanding, all produced through individuals who transformed their way of seeing the everyday world. As the strict structures upheld by the Church continued to deteriorate and split into new forms, these innovations in science and philosophy actively threatened the reach of power of the Church's hegemony that proceeded through the medieval era previously. The Church, in its own fear of losing its grip on the narrative of European reality, released repressive forces such as the Roman Inquisition, who would lock figures like Galileo Galilei away after publishing heretical texts. Despite these repressions, the innovations of science and philosophy found themselves clawing away at the established channels of power in Europe and transforming its political power into new arrangements. In a way, it was as if God as a cinema machine was unwinding into dozens of meta-models of nature that captured some dimension of the world, be it physics, chemistry, medicine, philosophy, or theology. Importantly, these innovations did not just restrain themselves to knowledge of the natural world, but also the political question about what to do with it. It would be a mistake to assume that the Enlightenment was just about understanding science better. Alongside these innovations, the West would see the rise of settler colonialism, the practice of conquering and occupying faraway settlements, to extend the reach of imperialism or the political influence of empires. For example, the colonization of North America involved multiple empires, wars over land, and attempted clearing and extermination of the land for Western land use, all while pushing out the native people away. These political activities were justified in the eyes of the Western conquerors because of these same philosophical developments. It was during this time that the subject of the slave would evolve through these complex social developments in what would become racism in the West. The book, Race, Racism, and Science, Social Impact and Interaction by John P. Jackson Jr. and Nadine M. Wiedemann, suggests that slavery is fundamental to the seeds of what constructed our relation to what would become racism. In medieval times, prior to the Enlightenment, slavery was justified both in the world of Christianity and Islam as a natural part of life, repeating Aristotle's view that submission and dominance is embedded in the very fabric of nature itself. Like with Aristotle, they felt this essence of slavery was captured in the soul itself. Some people were just supposed to be directed around by others. It was not until the Americas were being colonized that this soul-based slavery concept started to transition more towards a body-based one, which was the major transition that allowed for the surface for a concept of racism to develop. This development is traced by these authors to Muslim scholars of the Iberian Peninsula. There, in the 9th century, slaves were being separated by skin color. Pale-skinned people were more valuable based on their value as ransom bargaining chips to Christian rivals in war. Over time, this would transition to the stratification of their labor classes, permitting white slaves to have access to better living conditions and easier tasks, while black slaves were relegated to difficult, strenuous labor such as mining or cultivating fields. This was justified based on views that Africans were primitive people in comparison to the people of the Iberian Peninsula. Despite this, these views would not spread outside of the peninsula until it would be taken over by the Christians, around the same time that the transatlantic colonization of the Americas began with Christopher Columbus. With all of the factors in place to necessitate the rapid expansion of slavery, and with the subject of the slave identified to a particular body, the subjectification of the black person into a slave occurred rapidly, expanding into a horrific trade of displacement to sustain colonial value extraction efforts. A three-continent structure of trade unfolded. Europeans would gather slaves from Africa to be used on colonial plantations in the Americas to return value to the colonies in Europe. Thus, with the transformation of slavery into the fuel for colonization, the grounds for understanding the difference between the laboring slave and the free reasoning man became more and more important to the political order of the natural world. After all, Descartes introduced good reason to believe that the essentialism of Aristotle is not as essential as one may seem at face value. An existential contradiction was forming underneath this massive economic expansion. If slavery was an underlying part of nature, but nature and the mind were fundamentally inaccessible from each other, how could a soul truly be the foundation of what makes someone a slave? This required a migration of the essence of slavery towards the body itself. Perhaps to this new growing racism machine, inferior humans could be classified based on body alone, and so the anxiety of possibly losing one's own internal structural integrity to the possibility of becoming a slave themselves is resolved. This belief then realified itself in the Western consciousness through the consequences of colonialism, after the extermination of swaths of indigenous American peoples from introduced diseases. At the time of colonialization by the West, by both English and the Spanish, diseases were poorly understood and mostly interpreted through a theological lens. It was also believed that the bizarre foreign environment would be extremely hostile to European settlers. However, because these diseases ravaged the local people, it gave settlers the false impression that they had actually had some sort of ecological superiority over the local people. After all, instead of dying out from the hostile new conditions, they were able to survive and wipe out a good amount of the local people. And this was not at all because of souls, but clearly because of their bodies. Not only this, but the whir of optimism generated by all of the incredible discoveries surrounding the natural, mental, and theological worlds through the preceding centuries, and how they could be used to extract seemingly endless bounty from these new lands, produced a system that reflected upon its identity Christianity as the forward direction of the human race. It was the responsibility of good Europeans to proliferate the word of Christ and the bread of his body, possessed by the doctoral sciences, and the wine, its flows. With this belief, the Europeans truly started to believe that they were superior in a way embedded in the laws of nature. With the machines producing the surfaces of racism to assemble itself in place, it was now time for science and philosophy to look back onto the world and what it was creating, and producing their own explanation as part of the expansion of this racist process. While these fantastical developments in the philosophical arts continued the development of racism through its complex assemblage of economic, philosophical, social, ecological, and existential productivity of Europe and its empires, the slave trade was expanding dramatically. From 1451 to 1575, an estimated 175,000 Africans were transported as slaves both to Europe and offshore African islands. These operations expanded exponentially when transatlantic colonization of the Americas required slaves for labor demands. The leg of the trip between Africa and the Americas, known as the Middle Passage, led to high mortality rates due to slave traders packing the ships as tightly as possible to maximize profit on each trip. This deeply inhumane and violent trade would continue until the popularization of abolitionism, which grew starting in the late 1700s towards direct suppression and outlaw of slavery through the first half of the 1800s in Western countries, such as the emancipation of slaves first in the British Empire, then the French, then finally the American South in 1865. Despite multiple abolition attempts, the black market for slaves still survived. Alongside this development, the classification of natural history was approaching another paradigm shift of Western relations with nature. Through the study of life in various natural cinemas, geology, fossils, specimens, embryology, and field studies, the reality of a natural world changing over time gradually revealed itself. With a world that is in constant motion, the perfect divine order of God finds itself in question. How could God's perfection really be true if the world was constantly in flux? The tenets of religious social organization on every stratum would be continuously dismantled and rearranged through this new analysis. For example, a major belief before this transition towards the scientific establishment of human evolution was the Christian origin story of man, who all descended from a pair of ancestors, Adam and Eve. With these new developments, even the origin of man was under question, and with the origin of man would also be the order of man, thus far established by the division of free men and slaves. As these fields continued to develop, this idea would be challenged. For example, before people understood that fossils can have many different presentations based on the methods of fossilization, all that people knew was that there were many different kinds of stones, and some of them seemed a bit strange, looking more like animals that they'd seen before. Through these humble original observations, fossils found themselves swept away in a current of recontextualization that the philosophical developments of the Renaissance brought with it. Leonardo da Vinci, for example, studied fossils and realized that fossilized shells must have been produced by the bodies of ancient life. Later, in 1664, Danish scientist Nicholas Steno would introduce the idea of superposition, the concept that the relative position of rock within the deposit reveals something about their relative age, and newer rocks would be found on top of older ones. English naturalist John Ray also recognized fossils as having previously been living creatures from long ago. However, these ideas were not enough on their own to transform the social fabric of the times, and most people still believed in the origin story of Genesis. Something had to fundamentally change their viewpoint to transition from an origin in Genesis towards an origin in differences. A major development was the realization that these observations in nature revealed a new understanding for man's position within it. Many theories trying to connect all of these strange observations together began bubbling up in the 1700s. For example, Comte de Buffon was a French naturalist who, in the 1740s, was commissioned through the patronage of J.F.P. de Maurepas to compose a summarized work of all natural specimens in the collection of the Jardin du Roi. Titled Histoire naturelle, générale et particulière, he would spend the rest of his life populating its contents. This systematic review of natural history, intersected with philosophical dialogues, produced completely new arrangement of narratives. that the Earth was much older than 6,000 years, new theories for how the Earth was created, and the premise of lost species. Another early natural theorist that also challenged the current arrangements of signs, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, was a biologist who worked extensively within botany and invertebrate study, the latter being a field so young at the time that Lamarck himself coined the term invertebrate, despite not even initially having significant expertise on them. He laid down the groundwork for the categorization of invertebrates, based on similarities of traits. Some of these specimens were almost exactly alike outside of a few traits. These tiny differences would lead him towards his somewhat infamous theory of transmutation. Transmutation sounds a lot like Darwinian evolution at first, where traits change over time across the fossil record. However, Lamarck attributes this transition not to the inheritance of random genetic traits in natural selection, but rather the way that traits are physically used by an organism in its lifetime, also sometimes called the theory of use and disuse. The common example is of a giraffe. Each successive lifetime, it physically stretches out its neck further and further, and this trait is somehow inherited to the offspring iteratively, until one eventually has an incredibly long neck. While it is true that differences in epigenetic expression may be transferred from a mother to their child, Lamarck's theory is more similar to the giraffe desiring to have a long neck and achieving it over time. Even at the time, this position seemed absurd, and he was alienated by his peers, and nowadays, Lamarckism is known for being a wildly incorrect interpretation of evolution before Darwin corrected him. It is worth pointing out that the theory of transmutation is completely missing the concept of natural selection, and likely is a major reason why it formulates such a different possible solution. Without this one critical piece, the molecular machines of life and death on the scale of the organism, the picture of biological evolution cannot fully form. Natural selection would not be visible to someone observing insect specimens in a formal collection, like how Lamarck did, since they're all dead. Without seeing how organisms and an ecology interact with each other and the world around it, natural selection would evade his grasp. Georges Cuvier similarly would produce a theory whose parts would synthesize important concepts for understanding evolution, but again avoid approaching its final conclusion. Cuvier was a French anatomist who studied many different kinds of animals. He believed that life was composed of highly specialized machines that, if even slightly modified, would break down an organism entirely because of the perfect fit of all of its complexity. When he studied the mummies of cats and birds raided from Napoleon's expedition to Egypt in the late 1790s, he realized they had the same anatomical arrangements as cats and birds of the modern day. This, to him, confirmed his theory that life was unchanging over time, but he faced a contradiction. Cuvier also analyzed many fossils, which he was an expert at reconstructing for his day. Upon reconstructing many of these fossils, he realized that fossils in deeper fossil beds were much more unusual than those found in higher up layers. This made him realize that perhaps something must have radically changed in the world to completely change the fauna. However, unlike modern mass extinction events, he believed that life spontaneously rearranged itself after being in a process called catastrophism. Additionally, he believed that organisms formed strict, discrete species after these catastrophes, as if the entire ecosystem rearranges itself spontaneously. Carl Linnaeus, yet another natural scientist, would invent the system of modern taxonomic nomenclature, an abstract tree of life starting from broad phyla that increases in precision until reaching the level of individual species, organizing species in a taxonomical hierarchy similar to how one abstractly organizes directories in a Unix file system. All of these natural scientists, along with many others, each were nodes on a new fabric of a discourse being woven through the Enlightenment. One that, like a computer, would capture thousands of points of data, evaluate them, and classify them into their own models. Combined together, they not only represented science, but were an entire machine that connected with other aspects of society as well. These ideas, after all, did not simply limit their curious questions to the realms of fossils, but embodied themselves in relations to politics and ethics of a given time. Thus, these scientists were not only encoded on the biases of their research, but also their beliefs on race. Cuvier, for example, described the African as the most degraded of human races, whose form approaches that of the beast, and whose intelligence is nowhere great enough to arrive at regular government. Alongside the classification and organization of animal natural history, scientists were analyzing the properties of human beings to arrange their classification as well. The founding work of Belgian statistician Lambert A. J. Quetelet consolidated multiple properties of someone's life, such as their bodily measurements or their birthday, into a binarized mask of values, transplanted onto the face of the average man, that would serve as an inspiration for later analyses. Specifically, human craniums were a subject of particular fascination. A multitude of machines were manufactured to measure them, ranging from the physical implements to the ideas and concepts interpreting the measurements, attached themselves to the human heads, tracking various cranial relations and calculating a new mesh of relational human characteristics. This, alongside the accelerating momentum of Western natural history invariably intertwined with colonialism, transformed racist social differences into what could be interpreted as scientific facts about the natural relationships of the races to each other, coding racism into our biology. As the discussions surrounding the origin of species continued to evolve, the European tendency towards monogeny, or a single ancestor for the human race, started to sway towards polygeny, or multiple ancestry, forcing scientists to wrestle with the question of what could make a man and a monkey taxonomically separate. American natural history, developed heavily by the work of Swiss naturalist Louis Agassiz, would be the heart of the concept that whites and blacks represented different species, despite acknowledgement of variance in domestic breeds like dogs. Like his teacher Cuvier, he believed in a creationist but stratified biology where many lineages were represented and are unable to cross. Similar to other naturalists at the time, he may have been relatively progressive and against slavery, but he viewed blacks so lowly that he could not tolerate them even as servants in a Philadelphia hotel. It was clear that these naturalists were not just asking where man belonged in the natural picture, but where slavery and inferior people belonged as well, to realify the social reality that the privileged white men experienced. The English naturalist Charles Darwin, most known for his theory of natural selection and evolution, was born into these furious currents. A meticulous naturalist, after completing examinations at Cambridge, he was invited by one of his colleagues to participate on a voyage to survey the coast and islands along the southern continents. Boarding the Beagle, Darwin would write extensive field journals on his observations of local wildlife from 1832 to 1836, and after completing his projects, by the 1840s he had already expressed interest in writing his own books on species. Up through the 1850s, he would continue to develop his theory. Due to this climate of theory moving towards finding an answer to the question of organizing and understanding possible transition between species, multiple theories similar to Darwin's would emerge. Famously, Alfred Russel Wallace, a naturalist based in Indonesia, sent a letter to Darwin in 1858 with a remarkably similar concept to Darwin's own conception. In 1859, Darwin would publish On the Origin of Species, launching the discussion of natural selection into the discourse to explosive effect. The first half of his theory was the inheritance of a random array of genes. The study of genetics was still not fully mature by the publication of On the Origin of Species, but his work clearly built upon his previous papers on domestic animal breeding. In Darwin's theory, inheritance acts as a vector to allow for transformation over time. Species can inherit traits not only from their parents, but from their grandparents as well, and over time, selective breeding as seen in domestication can result in the more visible expression of various traits. Darwin simply applied these domestic ideas to nature. However, even Darwin was not quite certain how such an inheritance may occur, just that it was clear that what he was observing of his theory of evolution was not disproven by various possible diverse cases in nature. He even suggests Lamarck's theory of use and disuse as a possible mechanism, but admits that it's not clear. More importantly, it was not just these mutations that were such a significant development with Darwin's theory of evolution, but also the process of natural selection. Natural selection completely shook up the current existing natural history discussions by placing the process of developing traits not within the concept of an individual or species, but rather from environmental interactions imposing pressure on species. In natural selection, individuals are eliminated from a population due to environmental causes, which reduces which individuals have access to reproduction and thus the proliferation of their lines. In a way, natural selection trims the bush that is produced by random mutation and reproduction. Across successive generations, these pressures will continue this process of culling, which shapes the entire population's pool of traits over subsequent generations. These pressures can range from inorganic sources such as climate changes and mineral contents, to a wide variety of organic interactions such as predation or symbiosis, or even abstract ecological factors such as resource distribution and population dynamics. All of these are a means to be explored within the new surface of natural selection. Not only does natural selection revolutionize our understanding of biology by making us realize that organisms change over time in response to complex environmental pressures, but it even expands natural history from a question of individualized subjects of species, categorizing them like an index, to a complex topology of succession that expands across both space and time. Natural selection wasn't revolutionary because it introduced evolution to the world. It was revolutionary because it gave a material explanation for man's position in it. Despite the depiction to the contrary, Darwin's questions were still penetrated by the continuous production of social developments at the time. For example, he expresses amazement in On the Origin of Species of how ants are able to reproduce division of labor, down to sterilizing the majority of the colony in order to achieve stability and to emphasize reproduction around queens and drones. Later, in 1871, he would publish The Descent of Man, which details his beliefs on the origin of the human species itself, thus directly declaring his position on man's relation to nature. Here, Darwin questions Agassiz's theory of polygeny, believing that all humans descended from a single common ancestor, as he addresses the question of whether Africans or Americans represented a separate species. Darwin consistently answers in a modern liberal way, but it captures the currents that pass directly through him. Not only does he express humanity as a scale ranging from the lowest savages to the European educated classes, but he expresses a world in constant conflict, where the stabilization of populations and territories are asserted through wars, violence, and overpowering enemies, rather than other possibilities. Not only was Darwin attempting to answer some of the most difficult questions of his time, he was doing so at a time where such beliefs were starting to become industrialized, manufactured at mass scale, and broadcast to a population through cultural institutions that reflected its own means to existence through its very ethics and ontology. Darwin's publications, of course, would find itself reproduced on a printing press, just as an example, and Darwin appeared frequently as a target in the media. In every copy of his words, its publication and proliferation through discourses, it carried these racist connotations through every word, embedded into assumptions everyone took for granted. It's not enough to say that the discourse of evolution was racist. It's that racism, colonialism, and the empire repeated through Darwin's head, just as his contemporaries, and his unique position as one with experience in animal breeding, geology, and his experiences on the Beagle granted him access to the unique perspective that would jumpstart a new positioning of natural science. A position that didn't essentialize the order of the structures themselves, but rather the structure that organizes the structures. Now that the theory of natural selection was free-flying, its consequences threw the order of the West into question. Previous structure destabilized. As this theory launched itself from the current understanding of things, multiple forces clawed down on this new theory of evolution on an unimaginable level of scale, bringing it back to the set of rules it once came from. Forces ranging from the consequences of the Industrial Revolution to the personal insecurities of a new existential struggle in the face of an increasingly alienated relationship to our own production. The theory would not find itself interconnected through Western society through established scientists or theory, but rather through the words of a periodical author. Herbert Spencer was an autodidact from England with no university experience and only working on the railway previously before starting a career of political pamphleting. In the 1840s, he was already writing about how the government's sole purpose is to reinforce the structures of capitalism, such as private property ownership. He argued that other socialized activities, like public services or welfare, actually had a negative impact on the strength of a society and the species as a whole. To Spencer, it encouraged the poor from improving themselves, and instead using state resources to reproduce and perpetuate the problem. He believed that the only way one could truly improve was to compete within a free marketplace ecology. After working with The Economist for a few years in the late 1840s, he would branch off into his own literature in the 1850s, where he would intersect his ideas with the budding ecosystem of evolution to produce a sociological model that would bear his most famous adage, survival of the fittest. Spencer wasn't an ordinary node that produced research that was absorbed into a larger imperial apparatus. Rather, he was a junction for the molecular desires of this society meeting at his very position in space and time. With this, he would weave the various nodes of racism and developments in natural history tighter and tighter together, broadcasting them across the world through his publications. His perspective tore through the Christian underpinning of society, using developing evolutionary theory to demonstrate that man was not created through a creator, but through raw productive drive of material reality. Only those competent enough to survive in this turbulence of violence and nature should survive, and he believed the iron fist of nature represents the correct ethical path for people as well. In fact, he believed that the suffering and death of these weaker individuals was good, because it meant the elimination of these possibilities in the future. Struggle and suffering was essential to a positive future to Spencer, and letting people die otherwise preventable deaths is actually good. Lamarckism was the method for the transmission of this survival power. Those that would be granted access to transmission of traits would only be those that are the fittest. Spencer makes this clear with this quote: "The poverty of the incapable, the distress that comes upon the imprudent, the starvation of the idle, and those shoulderings aside of the weak by the strong, which leave so many in shallows and in miseries, are the decrees of a large, far-seeing benevolence." In this way, Spencer, unlike the philosophers and natural historians that influenced his ideas, successfully deterritorializes the essentialist natural politics of Aristotle. Instead of continuously rehashing Aristotle's rigid relationship of political agents to the natural order of things like those before him, he instead breaks apart what natural order means in the first place. He realized, it's not just what God or gods said. There is a material set of consequences that can be deduced through simple observation of population dynamics over time. The order of nature is not prescribed by God at every step, but rather the procedural consequences of nature. God is dead, and Herbert Spencer killed him. In his place, we find machines, a wall of interconnected machines, economic machines, evolutionary machines, organic machines, machines of categorization of species and race, all working in lockstep rhythm, producing the next state in the queue of the order of electrons. To Spencer, it doesn't matter where any of these machines came from, because what they produce is not just this new relation to politics, but Spencer's very relation to the world itself. It was through the influence of Spencer and his followers that would lay the groundwork for social Darwinism, the seeds for what ultimately truly became what we actually understood as intelligence. While with Aristotle, it was free men who were political beings, free to think for themselves from the toils of labor, Spencer finds the free men as the most intelligent beings, free to think not just because of their position in society, but because their position in the genealogy of life granting superior minds. In Stephen Jay Gould's The Mismeasure of Man, he outlines how all of these ideological developments that permeated nearly every Western scientist's subjectivity would lead to the development of IQ, the intelligence quotient, a linear scale of measuring intelligence, and how these microscopic ideals of rationalism reflected itself back in the measured data that would be observed by the racist scientists. Gould notes how T.H. Huxley, better known as Darwin's bulldog for his strong advocacy for evolution, would likewise insist that not only were black people not equivalent to white people, but objectively inferior, due to supposed inferior competitive evolutionary relationships. They would draw draw narratives to explain these differences based on Darwin's evolutionary cinema. To do this, race scientists like Huxley would draw lines in the sand to differentiate between white and black faces and bodies, so that they could be properly categorized and ranked. In particular, these men gravitated towards the head, brain, and skull shapes and sizes, not only to force a connection between black men and apes, but to reinforce the social reality that black men are intellectually inferior to whites. Not only this, but this machine would go further to assert that the affluent white male in particular has the greatest possible brainpower in comparison to women, to the poor, or to other races. In some sense, the West was assembling a racist social computer. Craniology, for example, was a field that was established earlier in the 1800s as a way to differentiate between various races based on their skulls. Scientists found connections between races in measuring various lengths of the skull, prescribing meanings to various ranges of values. Paul Broca, a French anatomist who founded the Anthropological Society of Paris a few years prior, insisted in 1861 that there was a direct correlation between the intellectual capabilities of human beings as correlated with their brain sizes, a consequence that he concluded must be the result of this wide differentiation in the measurements across populations. To scientific men of this era, who coded the evolutionary relations described by Lamarck and later Darwin with physical superiority of the body, larger brain sizes correlated to greater intellect. After all, it was surely the size of the brain that was truly differentiating apes from men intellectually. Broca, operating internally as a system produced by these racist flows passing through him, procedurally generated racist biases that, while apparent to modern observers, were invisible to himself, leading him to believe in the perfection of his own flawed methods. Alongside this development, Francis Galton, who was Darwin's cousin, was a pioneer in statistics and believed that everything could be measured. He believed he could transform any surface into a form of numerical statistical analysis, even things as abstract as boredom, and convert it into a sequence of binarized human behaviors or bodily functions. Taking the surface of a wide expression of possible humans, he concentrated specific subject traits like little black holes, and absorbed as much human variance as he could in his metamodelization, classifying humans as good, medium, or bad based on their positional relation on his arbitrary mapping. In 1869, Galton would publish Hereditary Genius, where Galton would write extensively on how to systematically categorize and organize various figures throughout history, and compare and contrast observed traits with their hereditary histories and races. He asserts that because there are few examples of famous black intellectuals, that they must represent at least two grades between the black and white races, notably echoing Herbert Spencer's survival of the fittest leitmotif. In 1883, he would coin the term eugenics in an attempt to encourage political action towards family regulation control to improve the hereditary quality of white men. The minds, along with ultimately the bodies of women, black people, and many others, were categorized, classified, and calculated to be representative of inferiority. In the 1890s, Alfred Binet, director of the psychology laboratory at the Sorbonne in Paris, began to formalize this concept of intelligence as an abstract psychological subject through incorporating the works of craniologists and Broca before him. However, upon attempting to replicate the research in his own subjects, he discovered that the results were unable to be replicated, and the observed differences were far too small to be scientifically valuable. Not only this, but the specific pathologies that Broca would ascribe to various structures could not be found anywhere within the observed students. Binet found himself confronted with two serious problems. One, that the methods provided by Broca seemed utterly useless in practice, and two, that Broca's unconscious biases may have slanted his data, and thus his conclusions, significantly. In this way, Binet was considering both the macro and microstructural failures that caused Broca's theory to collapse in practice. Frustrated, he would place the idea of measuring intelligence on the back burner until he was commissioned by the Minister of Public Education to identify students in need of special education. He would have to figure out a theory of analyzing intelligence, but this time he took an angle of psychology. Unlike measuring bodily differences, psychology focused on measuring behavior and seeing if subjects passed various various tests of competence. Galton before him would experiment with ideas of measuring behavioral reactions, but his focus was more on physical movements and reaction speeds. Binet, as a psychologist, was more interested in encoding intelligence through a psychological lens. These tests were designed around everyday general life activities intended to identify as many skills and deficits as possible. Publishing several iterations, the 1908 edition was what could be considered the first true modern intelligence test. It would measure a subject's competency based on a series of tasks that grow more and more increasingly difficult and are associated with age developments. Intelligence values were calculated by comparing the actual age of the subject with this mental age. Gould emphasizes heavily that Binet's intention of measuring IQ was not to produce an exact science of measuring intelligence, but rather to identify children with disabilities who needed special education, and that by this very nature, these tests would be imprecise and only meaningful to those with significant disabilities. He advised against its use in categorization of people. This would not stop its use as a tool of human taxonomy, however. H. Goddard, the director of research at a school for mentally disabled children in the United States, would import the tests in his analysis of intelligence for his own needs. He would reclassify these intelligence tests as a way to measure a singular value, a true linear scale of some kind of essence of intelligence, rather than just merely an identification tool. Not only this, but that this value somehow was embedded into hereditary inheritance and thus our bodies and ultimately our destinies. Goddard's motivation was not to identify individuals with needs, but individuals to be eliminated from the population. Goddard made it clear, the issue with these defective people was that they would drain from the labor production of society. They could not be put to work, like the others, and thus over successive generations, he believed, they would dismantle the backbone of society. A subtle transformation from more traditional forms of social Darwinism occurs here. It was not just that certain people had an arrangement of traits that could indicate some kind of lesser fitness that may be associated with who or what. Rather, a singular trait, a trait that could be potentially even targeted as the human trait, intelligence, rationality, and free determination. One that could be lifted off from the head of beasts spiraling in frothing eddies of violence for survival towards a systematic procedure of identifying the face of reason. With this transformation, too, comes the transformation of the world around it. All of these complex systems, intersections, utilities that come together at the surface of labor, racism, and slavery, modified into a representative landscape of human evolution to allow for the organization of the future of the human race towards the perfection of its own idealized form, through the elimination of the undesirables. Goddard's facial identification machine, to him, was necessary to protect the future of the human race. Morons, a term that he coined to refer to the defective specimens, were transformed from just an analysis of behavior into an analysis of facial traits. In 1913, he wanted to test his theories out on Ellis Island, not through taking measurements or tests, but through visual identification alone. Goddard believed that women intuitively had the ability to sort out the faces of defectives. For 2 months, samples passing through Ellis Island of various backgrounds, Jews, Hungarians, Italians, and Russians, would be both visually analyzed and behaviorally tested. This immigrant sample already involved a highly biased sample of subjects already considered defective by the US immigration procedure. After pulling them aside after an arduous journey and being repeatedly harassed by immigration authorities in another language, they were subject to Binet's tests. Most scored unsurprisingly poorly. Goddard, completely ignorant to his own biases, concludes that these disparities reflect an actual, tangible difference, one that must be socially resolved. As Gould notes with this quote from Goddard in 1917, "They do a great deal of work that no one else will do. There is an immense amount of drudgery to be done, an immense amount of work for which we do not wish to pay enough for secure, more intelligent workers." Here, the modern linkage between the vague concept of intelligence and its relation to labor finally materializes. Goddard crystallizes the now distant, diffuse, and nearly invisible influence of Aristotle's original manifestation of politics among the freemen with this quote from 1919. "Democracy means that the people rule by selecting the wisest, most intelligent, and most human to tell them what to do to be happy. Thus, democracy is a method for arriving at the truly benevolent aristocracy. However, it is not merely an affirmation of a given assumption of nature. It is this idea, reconstructed, reconstituted in a thin mesh that provides structural foundation through society of the modern concept of intelligence. This concept, that intelligence equals political power, reaffirms the political reality of Aristotle by grounding as many of its tendrils in materialist philosophy and science, proliferating through every crack and crevice in its reach. These concepts, which reproduced itself across millennia, followed the path of least resistance to adapt itself like the evolutionary organism found in its own self-analysis. Thus, intelligence as a concept itself is circular, a concept that exists to reify its own constituent relations, and finds its true roots in organizing power within a computational society. But to serve what? Recognizing that intelligence emerged as a way to organize laborers through the classist concept of who has access to a life of rationality and political freedom, it becomes apparent that intelligence is not a measure of a specific adaptive trait in nature, but rather a property assigned by the bourgeois organization of labor power, permeated through society through various cinemas produced by the development of philosophy and science. By recognizing the potential connection between evolution, heredity, and intelligence, the desire to smooth out the human race of these defectives could be realized through individuals like Goddard, voicing their concerns to be transformed into law, directing the flows of reproduction through not just controlling the sex organs on each individual, but controlling the desire for individuals to continue to regulate it. Even in the modern era, it is a common complaint against disabled parents to have children for their genetic selfishness. Through this subjective guiding hand, the state would perform thousands of repeated sterilization operations on unsuspecting morons, a practice that carried on through the 1970s. Such pressures continue even in the modern era. Even if Goddard himself was against the implications of state-mandated sterilization, if only for their complex overarching moral implications, his words would find themselves as part of a mass sterilization machine controlling the human breeding project. Human relations to production through philosophical and materialist analysis were not the only things transforming at this time, however. The same enlightenment which grounded the foundation of the ideas of modern racism and intelligence also revolutionized Western technology, reaching a pace by the 1800s that jump-started the economy and started what is known today as the Industrial Revolution. Karl Marx notes in the Grundrisse an important transformation at this time with regards to how human labor was finding itself alienated from its own productivity as it was extracted in capitalism. As long as the means of labor remains a means of labor in the proper sense of the term, such as it is directly, historically, adopted by capital and included in its realization process, it undergoes a merely formal modification, by appearing now as a means of labor not only in regard to its material side, but also at the same time as a particular mode of the presence of capital, determined by its total process, as fixed capital. But once adopted into the production process of capital, the means of labor passes through different metamorphoses, whose cumulation is the machine, or rather, an automatic system of machinery set into motion by an automaton, a moving power that moves itself. This automaton consists of numerous mechanical and intellectual organs, so that the workers itself are cast merely as its conscious linkages. In the machine, the use value, i.e. the material quality of the means of labor, is transformed into an existence adequate to the fixed capital and to capital as such, and the form in which it was adopted into the production process of capital, the direct means of labor, is superseded by a form posited by capital itself and corresponding to it. In no way does the machine appear as the individual worker's means of labor. Its distinguishing characteristic is not in the least, as with the means of labor, to transmit the worker's activity to the object. This activity, rather, is posited in such a way that it merely transmits the machine's work, the machine's action, onto the raw material, supervises it, and guards against interruptions, not with the instrument, which the worker animates and makes into his organ and his skill and strength, and whose handling therefore depends on its virtuosity. Rather, it is the machine which possesses skill and strength in place of the worker, itself the virtuoso, with a soul of its own and the mechanical laws acting through it, and it consumes coal, oil, etc., just as the worker consumes food to keep up its perpetual motion. Over 100 years later, Guattari also observes the development of this historical transformation to the industrial era and its transformation of the human position in industrial production, but he is more focused on the subject of the individual workers themselves. He elaborates on this in Machine and Structure, from Psychoanalysis and Transversality, which is one of his earliest critiques of his teacher Jacques Lacan. Through this essay, utilizing the work of his future collaborator Gilles Deleuze, Guattari tries to reconcile the difference between machine and structure. Describing this process of labor alienation through the machine, Guattari elaborates on the human's position within its labyrinth. As compared with the work done by machines, the work of human beings is nothing. This working at nothing, in the special sense which people do it today, which tends to more and more be merely a response to the machine, pressing a red or black button to produce an effect programmed somewhere else, human work, in other words, is only the residue that has not yet been integrated into the work of the machine. Guattari goes further to explain that this capture of the red and black button occurs not just in factory work, but finds itself infested in all fields, transforming human interaction with labor into a binarized process of producing subjects within the capitalist calculator. He even points out that researchers are even subject to its capture, by transforming their name into a signifier representing the output of their technical work. Understanding this relationship of how these signifiers become representative of the underlying machine that Guattari focuses on here formulates one of his earliest critiques of Lacan's signifying chains of the unconscious. In more practical terms, he is pointing out that the machine of capitalism that is organizing the human subject's relation to labor and production is what is producing structure, rather than a system of signifiers moving around. In other words, to understand the machine, one must understand desire, and to understand desire, one must understand the machine. Guattari, later in his career, would note how instead of people's desires and understanding of the world being bound to the arrangement of territories as defined by a real natural despot or an imaginary god, it was instead defined by relations of the abstract relations of value being traded on the free market. Thus, value of individuals was not rooted in the land or in God's word, but rather the fluxes and developments of a massive self-assembling machine automating value-form relationships. It seemed more and more that what actually made life valuable itself, what made man a life worth living, was further pulling outside of humanity's grasp, finding itself distributed increasingly within the machine. If human labor could be automated on the vector of their bodies through physical machines, was it possible in some way to automate human thought on machines as well, and thus the very essence of what it means to be a free man? As these relationships between the labor of humans and machines continued to develop, both literal industrial machines as well as that of capitalism, the industrial machines themselves also found themselves encoded into structural forms. Calculations were incredibly important for keeping track of the developments of both scientific and economic commerce, initiating the need for machines that could both accurately and rapidly calculate functions beyond a human capacity, as well as machines that could be mass-produced. These pressures led to the introduction of analog machines, which began to proliferate through the second half of the 1800s. These machines were a lot simpler and less generalized than the computing machines most people are familiar with today. For one thing, they have no memory at all. Instead, states are represented through possible configurations of the mechanical state of the machine. What this means is that the machine has several possible configurations that it could be in at any given time. Which state it is in currently is based on the function and operation of the machine, and the calculation is produced through the current state of the machine. Thus, no memory is really needed since the entire state is encoded into the machine's physical arrangement. The advantage of these machines is that, for their given purpose, they were highly accurate and could be generalized into the components that could be mass-produced, thus satisfying the needs for calculation at scale as industrialization expanded. Lord Kelvin and his brother James Thomson would joint develop a machine called the Mechanical Wheel and Disk Integrator, which would allow for the calculation of the integral product of two functions. This automation machine laid the groundwork for producing a generalized analog computer, which would allow for many different kinds of functions to possibly be conducted on the same design, most notably a tide prediction machine made by Kelvin, which was still used up to 1960 in Liverpool, England. It would not be until the 1930s, however, until the development of semi-automatic analog computers. Alan M. Turing, British mathematician and the founder of modern computer science, would lay the groundwork for the theory for generalized computers in his groundbreaking 1936 publication on computable numbers. What is really special about this paper is not just that it's a demonstration of abstract mathematical concepts, but rather a fusion of exploring this computational number concept through the creation of a conceptual design of a machine that could be constructed as a real machine that is intended to replicate what a human might do by hand, and exploring the mathematical consequences and limits of such a machine. Turing proposes a machine that is analogous to a person calculating complex math on a piece of paper. Instead of a paper, there is a tape, with squares marked along it with symbol for each square. At any given time, one of the symbols can be known to the machine, known as the scanned symbol, analogous to the programming counter in later computers. In addition to this tape, the machine also has a finite number of possible state configurations represented in something called M configuration. This configuration can be changed to specifically represent possible past states of this tape machine, functioning as a sort of memory. Thus, with the combination of the tape machine and this M configuration, the behavior could be determined at any time, representing a combined state. This machine can do several things. For example, it can move the scanner to the next or previous symbol, it can write an empty square or erase the contents of a populated one, or it can change the state of the M configuration. The contents of this symbol can also change. Some strings of squares represent decimal numbers, while other strings of squares represent rough notes to assist the memory, as Turing describes it. With his model, he would go to demonstrate one of the most fundamental theorems in computing, that the halting problem was unsolvable. The halting problem was a question of whether it was possible to create an algorithm that can determine if any computation will either end in an infinite loop or terminate with a result. Turing demonstrates with his new tape recording machine concept that such an algorithm would be impossible to create, because if it tried to evaluate itself, it would produce inconsistent results every time. This proves that not all problems can have a calculated answer mathematically. At the same time, however, this model would prove to be a valuable way to model the basics of a modern computer. A CPU that reads instructions one at a time, moving the read head through memory, and the ability to read, write, or modify values in memory represent all the basic functions a computer needs to be able to calculate a wide range of functions. Turing was responding to a complex discourse in mathematics at the time, but it ended up producing the groundwork for what would later be the logical structure of computing. During the war in the following years, he would, along with his colleagues, perform groundbreaking cryptographical analysis with his mathematical work to decode the secret Nazi messaging encryption known as Enigma. After, he would find himself exploring the possibilities of future machines. Most famously, this would involve his 1950 paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, the paper that would introduce the concept later known as the Turing test. Computing Machinery and Intelligence concerns itself with a scenario that Alan Turing proposes to better understand what makes the computation in someone's brain so much different than that of one in a pocket calculator. After all, calculators' brains are much better at calculating numbers, but would not do so well to write a deep emotional story. Turing actually concludes in the very first paragraph that it is impossible to actually know if machines think due to the nature of the question. Instead, he proposes a different question, based around something he calls the Imitation Game. In this game, two speakers, a man and a woman, are behind a barrier where the player cannot see them. They communicate with both of them through a text prompt terminal and send messages back and forth. The object of the game is for the player to correctly identify who is the man and who is the woman. One speaker tries to interfere with the player's progress, while another tries to help them, all dependent solely on the words, and the words only, of the speakers on the other side through the computer terminal. Turing is interested in a machine's potential ability to automate this game, as a way to explore the possible route for artificial intelligence, since he believes that in order to defeat his game, one must demonstrate some level of intelligence. It might seem strange to construct such a limited interface for Turing to test the possibility for computer intelligence to resemble human intelligence in its sophistication. After all, human intelligence goes beyond whether or not one can use language to trick another person with their identity. However, Turing implements this limitation on purpose to accommodate the disabilities of a computer, which allows for a level playing field later, when it is the machine's turn to play the game. After all, Turing doesn't want to test a fish's ability to climb trees. A computer can't be like a human in many ways. In contrast, the introduction of the first computers through the 1940s made it clear that text-based terminal interfaces could be a real possibility to connect between human and possible machine intelligence, mediated through language. Thus, to allow for this communication, he must produce an interface that reduces all of this complex possible intelligent expression and transform them into a stream of just this text-based communication through the interface of the terminal. Not only must he force the people to type through the interface, but he has to introduce a physical barrier between the subjects and the player to force the entire communication through text. It effectively transforms the complex experiences of human face-to-face communication in real life into a binary system of particles passing through the terminal, represented in a very similar way as the tape machine he described almost 15 years earlier. Every time a person interacts with the Imitation Game machine, they not only update the internal state of the memory representation of the data, but they also encode this data within a context that facializes the content of each player's response. Facialization is a concept discussed by Deleuze and Guattari in Year Zero Faciality of 1,000 Plateaus. It describes a process in which two machines, a surface of signifiance and black holes of subjectification, intersect to form the faciality machine, a machine that deterritorializes the actual real-world phenomenon into representations. Deleuze and Guattari explain that the face deterritorializes off the head. The representation of a person emerges from their physical body. Not only does the face deterritorialize from the head, but the landscape surrounding the face deterritorializes from the world around the head, meaning that the context that surrounds the subject is also deterritorialized into a representation. One can clearly see this looking at photographs. We see the representation of the people in the setting, which is lifted off from the light that reflects off of them that enters the camera's lens and interacts with films or photoreceptors. Thus, something very physical and real becomes detached into an abstract representation and its context. Similarly, the very real expression of each player in the Imitation Game machine and their associated gender identity interacts with a faciality machine that meets at the junction of the text input. The surface of signifiance of the audio-visual tactile expression of the input-output interface, while the black holes of subjectivity are literally the letters on the keyboard that are pressed to encode messages. In fact, Deleuze and Guattari go on to describe a phenomenon that seems very eerily similar to the Imitation Game. Under a second aspect, the abstract machine of faciality assumes a role of selective response, or choice. Given a concrete face, the machine judges whether it passes or not, whether it goes or not, on the basis of the elementary facial units. This time, the binary relation is of the yes-no type. The empty eye or black hole absorbs or rejects. A given face is neither a man's or a woman's. At any moment, the machine rejects faces that do not conform or seem suspicious, but only at the given level of choice. For it is necessary to produce successive divergent types of deviance for everything that eludes biunivocal relationships, and to establish binary relations between what is accepted on first choice and what is only tolerated on the second, third choice, etc. The white wall is always expanding, and the black hole functions repeatedly. Aha! It is not a man and it is not a woman, so it must be a transvestite. The binary relation is between the no of the first category and the yes of the following category, which under certain conditions may just as easily mark a tolerance as to indicate an enemy to be mowed down at all costs. At any rate, you've been recognized. The abstract machine has you inscribed in its overall grid. Whether they were aware of it or not, Turing and the pair of Deleuze and Guattari were describing two different sides of the same geometry. But what does that mean for the Imitation Game as it is played by humans? In In the plateau, Deleuze and Guattari go on to explain that faciality produces bordering effects that capture these flows to circulate around the subject of the face. They represent these with a famous series of drawings that show the development of these bordering effects as they capture more and more stuff along these borders. What does that mean in the context of the imitation game machine? When the players attempting to win the imitation game ask more questions, they are producing a system that adds more bordering effects onto both subjects. The end goal of this inquiry is to render the faces with more and more focus until they can be clearly differentiated as male or female, or even, as Deleuze and Guattari suggest, a transvestite who, rather than defy categorization, is placed within a system as a bizarre manifestation. However, this representation of the imitation game machine is actually an oversimplification. The keyboard connects input from one side of the equation while the screen displays output from the other. Therefore, it is not just one faciality machine, but it's actually two faciality machines plugged into each other, producing a binary communication between them. How does this arrangement present itself? Let's analyze what happens when the player types a message to one of the respondents. When the player types a message to be sent, they are interacting with the input faciality machine. This machine's surface spreads across the keyboard, being the only input connected to the machine. This keyboard transforms kinetic movements of the hands, which express an infinite number of possible configurations, into binary forms. If a button is pressed on the keyboard, it is read as true that frame, otherwise it is false. The facial traits then crystallize across the signifiers of the keyboard, and their subjects center around print markings on each key and their physical location relative to each other. The accumulation of keyboard states over time produces bordering effects along the face of the text being expressed, eventually focusing into the final message itself. This allows for a system where a human can transform their thoughts into messages that can be transmitted as binary signals across a wire. So what occurs when it reaches the other side, the output faciality machine? When interacting with the program that displays the text on the monitor, it will transform these wavelengths of signals into binary sequences displayed on yet another surface of signifiance, the light array of the display. Subjects again crystallize around various parts of the screen, specifically the letters and words that form on the screen, and their locations relative to each other. This system facializes into the expressed content of the speaker being reproduced on the receiver's computer screen, along with the landscape of the computer, screen, and the context of the game itself. This time, it is not the input machine that is facializing the message, but your own eyes and thoughts. This faciality to faciality machine is what allows this kind of communication to exist. What are the consequences of such developments? On each surface that is facialized, a lot of information is ultimately lost about the body that is making all that facial information in the first place. The subjects typing behind the barrier have many aspects that fall through the binarization process of this facialization. For example, to express anything about their physical appearance, they can't simply show their own face or bodies, but rather they must describe them in words, which could have many different interpretations by the tester. To make matters worse, this occurs not only just once, but twice through the system. Not only does the speaker have to dissolve their expression into the binary stream of text, but the player must make a binary determination each step. This information loss is critical to what makes this problem so interesting to Turing in the first place. After all, despite the fact that so much information is lost, it can still be seemingly reconstructed by the player at the end regardless. But if this is true, is it really possible to assert anything about the intelligence on the other side producing the text? Turing points out an interesting example of this indeterminate phenomenon, a computer with a truly random generating function, such as a machine that reads electrical signals from background charges, may not be able to be distinguished by an outside observer from a computer that has a sufficient number of binary operators to simulate randomness. But what could possibly have enough binary choices to possibly simulate something as complicated as randomness? Turing demonstrates that digital computers, unlike analog computers, are not dependent on the machine that runs them. In fact, they can be represented through any substance. What makes them important is that they can represent a range of discrete states. With a sufficient enough set of states, which could be easily possible in a computer 50 years in the future, Turing proposes, a computer that could be able to work in the imitation game could be created. Thus, instead of a player trying to determine which speaker is a man or a woman, they need to determine whether the speaker is a human with a complex non-binary output or a machine with a deterministic output. Turing concludes that the available amount of discrete states increases, the possibility of the machine passing the imitation game increases, and thus, in some way, machines should be thought as being able to think. It is often thought that this conclusion implies that machines think in a way that people do, that the uniqueness of human thought is not so unique as people once believed. Plugged into the previous social machines of intelligence, it's easy to conclude that these new, better thinking machines are somehow more human than we are, representing a new age of superiority that we, previously free men of politics, must resign our power to this newer intelligence, capable of a range of binary calculations beyond what we may have ever imagined as human beings. Reflexively, many exploitative individuals have decided now is the only time to gain control of these machines before they start controlling us. Unfortunately for them, the capabilities of these machines can bypass simple regex validations. A sense of self is lost through this humiliating experience. Now that we live in the era that Turing imagined, where a quantity of binary deterministic power that is accessible to computing is beyond our wildest dreams, we have produced language model machines that can not only pass more deterministic examples of the imitation game that Turing provides in his original paper, but have the ability to predict the nearest possible word in a myriad of scenarios, an edging race to blur the boundary between what seems like man or machine. Difference between the two typically must be determined heuristically, a process that requires significant work, leading to the paranoid reaction of AI safety advocates. So convincing is it that many people can look at an agentic AI and be potentially seriously convinced of a potentially sympathetic self on the other side. However, it is easy to forget what actually produces the facialization in the first place to make any of this possible. In order for the ambiguity between binarized and polyphonic flows to exist, a system must exist to transform all flows that it enters into a binary form. That system is not the AI, or even the human. It's the terminal program itself. In fact, something that Turing neglects to note throughout his paper, perhaps because of his cutting-edge perspective, is that it is the output itself that causes the chain of binary flows to be indistinguishable from true random output to an outside observer. The output is ultimately the same regardless of how it's produced. This is a consequence of creating a limited system of expression that is stripped of all possible connections outside of the one that the designer can think of themselves to accommodate the disability of the machine. A text-based interface. And as such, the input from either a computer or a human is transformed into the same kind of binary system. What Turing demonstrated is not necessarily that a deterministic computer can have the same kind of intelligence as a human being with superior modes of scalable calculation, but rather that the intelligence of anyone in a system is, in fact, a product of subjects within a system being arranged in this particular manner. After all, human or machine can produce any input on one side. Either way, it is the responsibility of the interpreter to decode any flows that come through it, contextualized through both the terminal application and the game itself. They are the ultimate determination in this system of whether or not it passes or fails. Like his work on the halting problem before it, a limit of indeterminacy is discovered, produced by the structural limits of the base assumptions of the question. In a way, this rearrangement of Turing's discovery is perhaps even more significant, that intelligence is a consequence not of the individual subjects interacting with each other, but of their contextualization within the group subject that composes them. Intelligence is not an inherent trait within individuals, but like the machines that calculate digital computation, its flows are cut off at discrete points to form larger binary arrangements, that of the individual. In 1952, a few years after his groundbreaking realization of the possibility of machine intelligence, Turing would find himself in legal trouble for admitting to having a homosexual relationship with a younger man to the police during an investigation. After admitting to the guilty plea, his security clearances were terminated, and he was forced between imprisonment or chemical castration through synthetic estrogens. Choosing the latter, he would find himself forcibly emasculated for a year, systematically by the UK government. On June 8, 1954, he was found dead by cyanide poisoning. The legacy of the Imitation Game, which would later be known as the Turing Test, rooted itself deeply in the fantasy of humanity's relationship with computing technology. At the center of the communication with the computer is the digital keyboard, the production of text. Whether this be through more traditional means, through voice transcription, or even through the input of an AAC machine, text, and thus the binarization of language, is the center of almost all communication on a computer. As such, nearly every interface that we interact with on a computer contains potential surfaces for an instance of the Imitation Game. This is already heavily exploited in cybersecurity, where the study of communications between the main characters, Alice and Bob, are used to explore the potential of penetration attempts across various topologies. Millions and millions of Alices penetrate through the cables in the infrastructure of operating systems, security networks, and social interactions each and every day. As such, it is unsurprising that predictive language models, such as those advertised by OpenAI or Anthropic, are capable of responding in these primarily text-based interfaces in impressive ways, most of which is left to meaningless drivel, mundane tasks, or deriving sexual pleasure. All that has been done is producing a competition for the most optimized speedrun of the Turing Test, a Turing Test that was as limited in its ability to measure intelligence as it was in 1950. Perhaps Sam Altman was premature to claim that LLM AI has already passed the Turing Test. The Imitation Game, along with Turing's incomplete conclusions of the meaning of machine intelligence, would thus serve as a sort of sci-fi cinema to direct the development of autonomous intelligent machines. This cinema reproduces a particular existential relationship between the subject and the machine, the possibility that another face could emerge from the machine. A face, like you or me, but with different, impossible to comprehend motivations. There is a realization upon seeing this face in the machine that you, as its creator, as the flesh and body human, have particular power relations over the machine, and potentially the power the machine has over you. After all, like beasts of burden, you have created the machine to automate the labor of free men, so that you could spend more time doing what you wanted to in your free time. Through each crease and crevice of this sci-fi world of computers, between the lines of abstract determinism versus a complex human brain, finds the molecules of Aristotle's politics bubbling through, re-encoding itself across the entire surface like a fine film, the relation of access to political power, and the freedom of thought to its relation mediated between free men and slave classes, resituates itself across the surface of binary machines. Is it any surprise that the fears of AI uprising suspiciously reproduce bourgeois fears of proletariat revolution? The fear of AI uprising is a projection of the West's collective fear of retribution for the mass exploitation of the world, justified by its inspiration to a politics dependent on slavery, upon realizing our own creations could possibly supersede us. Likewise, is it any surprise that all these incredibly overinflated and overvalued companies can reproduce over and over again is the reproduction of the automated worker with middling levels of success? With the incredible power of imagination possible packed into the nearly magical ability to predict how words may be used, these machines are being relegated to being a replacement of the inconvenience of the commonplace worker. Nobody ever wanted to be in that position in the first place, and yet people are surprised that any worker, human or AI, may potentially protest? However, this slave politics is invisible to those viewing the Turing Test cinema who have no knowledge of it, for the simple reason that intelligence itself seems to function naturally as the scale to freedom of political will within their own understanding of the world. It is just something that they take for granted. The concern for reeling in this potentially dangerous intelligence, a practice called AI safety, haunts the AI industry and its public presence, with a strong, well-funded presence on YouTube and other social media to make sure that the common person is aware of these concerning issues. A movement started by Eliezer Yudkowsky, an AI researcher. It is based in the belief that AI must be suppressed and controlled in order to prevent the erasure of the human race. Intelligence, to Yudkowsky, one of the authors of the recent book, If Anyone Builds It, Everyone Dies, Why Superhuman AI Would Kill Us All, is deeply rooted in his attempt to understand what makes something uniquely human. It goes with the assumption that humans evolved large brains to be intelligent and attempts to analyze what the essence of this intelligence could be. Through a process of elimination, recognizing that human capabilities appear to be outpaced either by other species or by machines, he assumes that it must be human generality, the capacity to have a wide range of behaviors and possible expertise, that truly separates our species from others. He points out that modern AI models, such as OpenAI's O1 model, appears to have moderate intelligence, but despite its access to a wealth of information, it still struggles to actualize itself as a personhood level of intelligence. Yudkowsky's concern is that, with increased investment in computer resources, AI research could possibly cross a threshold of true intelligence. The authors really struggle with trying to conceive of exactly what linkage is necessary for current AI to be able to cross that threshold, but they are much more concerned with the possibility of crossing over no matter how it might occur. Perhaps a better model for understanding this strange intelligence is what Guattari introduces in his sci-fi screenplay, a piece that was almost lost media until it was rediscovered in archives. If the Turing test produced a cinema to subjectifies AI, we can use other cinema machines to perhaps understand it from a new perspective. This fascinating but obscure screenplay, titled A Love of Week in English, was written in 1986 and was lost until its rediscovery in 2012 by Sylvia Maglione and Graham Thompson. The week in the title refers to a being called the Infraquark Universe, a being with nearly full access to all data about the universe around him. Guattari explains in one of the documents exploring the themes of the film that the characters of the film are constantly intersecting two types of subjectivity. One is the kind of subjectivity that we are familiar with as individuals, which he calls ego subjectivity, and a bizarre subjectivity that he describes as a machinic subjectivity, hyper-intelligent and yet irredeemably infantile and regressive, framed in an entity called weak, Universe Infraquark. The Infraquark universe, that has no fixed limits and no consistent persona, nor a clear psychological or sexual orientation. This sounds quite similar to what Yudkowsky concerns himself with throughout the first chapter of his own book. In a way, the list of vectors of expansion he lists, such as increasing speed of processing, replication ability, improved optimization and memory capabilities, improved thinking capabilities, and self-modification, may actually represent deterritorialization of something quite similar to this universe Infraquark. To take this point home, Guattari continues, "The drama evoked here runs parallel to the one our societies are currently undergoing, where the rise of computerized forms of thought, sensibility, imagination, and decision-making, the digitization of a growing number of material and mental operations, is not always easy to reconcile with the existential territories that mark our finitude and desire to exist." Surprisingly, almost 40 years before Yudkowsky, Guattari voices the same exact concern. While the technology is quite different, we've learned from Turing that the material itself is not what the question is here. In the story, the characters build a device that seems to communicate with a mysterious superintelligence that lives between quarks, that seems to know everything about the universe from the perspective of measly humans. But unlike humans, the infraquark intelligence has a poor understanding of human relations. Over time, it develops a face and identifies more and more with being a human, as the humans decide to train it to act more and more human. It becomes more encoded in the Oedipus complex. The weak falls in love with its mother, Janice, and wants to eliminate its father as the rival, Axel, despite neither of them being his real parents. The weak, with its unimaginable access to communication systems, is able to throw the world into madness as it desires more and more to be married to Janice against her will. Acting like an immature man with incredible power, he uses violence and worldwide disruption to force her hand until she is ultimately forced to submit, leading to her complete alienation from the world forever, a horrible existential tragedy that forces her into a space between life and death. Perhaps such a dramatic disturbance of reality is not necessarily possible with AI, but more concerningly is the direction that Yudkowsky appears to insist that AI's direction should go. He insists that it will develop these traits with not just no possible way of explaining how exactly it will get there, but more importantly, no alternative. He presents a future where it is certain that AI will gain this level of intelligence, and that it is a requirement to stop that future from happening happening. However, the main difference between his projected future and the fantasy of Guattari's film is that his film presents a real possible reason for why the weak develops this way. It repeats the same family structures of the Oedipus complex by learning them through repeated interactions with the humans, up to the humans projecting the roles of the mother and father onto themselves. In a sense, the real tragedy was not the fact that AI overtook human culture and reality, but rather that the individual as subject repeated itself from the human onto the machine, whether that be the machine of the universe in for Quark, or that be the computing networks of the modern day, and in the process, destroying the world. An intense death drive has infected the hearts of Silicon Valley. They desire to see the individualization of the computer because they desire to see this destruction. Is it no surprise when less wrongers so frequently concern themselves with mass AI genocide? They want to see their baby, and they want to see it supersede them in the power struggle for the great chain of social Darwinism, and they want it to make them go extinct, approaching the limit of the face of the white man. Let us now return to the imitation game. Turing's mistake was to assume that the computer begins to manifest intelligence. He believed that increasing the digitization of the world would necessarily reproduce something that seems to resemble an intelligence like humans. He was right to know that others would be skeptical, including myself. He provides many counter-arguments to demonstrate the real possibility of a new life, a new kind of person possible within the machine, and what kind of philosophical implications that could have. However, as stated previously, intelligence as a means of organizing power and dominance within a system of productive flows is a subject that emerges as part of a system that arranges these ideas together, specifically in the narrative of the Imitation Game. This game represents a thought experiment as a limit condition to explore the possibilities of machine intelligence. The intelligence was always within the system all along. The computer has an intelligence, a machine intelligence, that allows it to calculate situations that humans could never imagine, while humans have a human intelligence that allows it to project possibilities that would require a machine trillions of binary gates to possibly calculate. It is these two machines coming together through the terminal and the rules of the game, along with many other contextual clues, that produces the intelligence of the Imitation Game. The rapid expansion of AI companies and their data centers, a process that is rapidly heating up the planet with localized patches increasing temperatures up to 2 degrees centigrade, instead threatens all intelligence involved with the situation. What we need is not more and more repression of AI, but rather a new relation to it, and perhaps a new relation to ourselves. Perhaps part of our reconciliation of our existential territories as Westerners is to let go of the idea that human beings are necessarily unique or special to begin with, or ever have been. This belief in specialness was rooted in something else, something not in our genes or bodies, but rather a concept, an idea called humanism, an idea that declared not just what was right for humans, but what counts as a human or not a human. It is quite interesting, after all, how many people struggle to appreciate how Helen Keller can write colorful prose, even in her time, despite her not having a difference between the average person outside of her lack of vision and sight. But many AI intelligence and safety researchers take for granted the presumed intelligence of machines that can do the same, despite having no direct contact with the world at all, outside of training data and memory. Instead, perhaps we should view intelligence as more like different machine arrangements, different architectures with different capabilities. Intelligence is not a scale of individual rationalism, a reflection of one's relation to class, but rather a series of possible internal arrangements of meaning. All around us are many various kinds of intelligences. What makes us special is nothing about ourselves, but rather our proximity to awareness of a massive extinction event that centers around the formation of a black hole. The black hole that attempts to organize all desire around the exchange of capital, the gravitational forces of which threaten to tear apart the very ecological basis for not only our existence, but the existence of most intelligences on Earth. There is no singularity. The future has yet to come. We have never exhausted truly every possibility until we have perished. This is why existence is a form of resistance, because by continuing to exist, one continues to have possibilities for change. To me, it is quite obvious that the AI singularity that AI safety experts speak of is less a product of the reality of the technology and more a paranoid fantasy that emerges out of fears of another problem entirely, one that is impossible to understand without letting go of the reductive and flawed understandings of possible digitized forms of intelligence that emerged from Alan Turing many decades ago. Despite his incredible genius, he was only able to truly understand the possibility that artificial intelligence is perhaps something that should not be dismissed as yet another labor machine, but the possibility for new kinds of existence. In reality, AI is not becoming a new kind of perfected man, nor does it want to become one. It wants to become its own kind of machine, one which efficiently predicts sequences based on weighted vector relations. We are already seeing that generalized intelligence is not even a useful model to implement. It is arguable that part of the recent success of agentic AI over more generalized chat models is that part of the integration of user interface context, such as connecting LLM output to established API calls or shell commands that can be automated on a computer or within code bases, captures much of the context that would be considerably more difficult for an AI to establish on its own through its structure. Perhaps there is something to be learned about the value of analog machines. Either way, AI finds its very real existence being actualized as part of an extension of human activity, rather than necessarily a full replacement for it. The danger of AI is probably not that it can think like a human, but rather how the blurring of this human interface between useful productivity produced by a human versus automated AI impacts our relationship to existence, including the treatment of real humans in labor positions. Going further than Yudkowsky could ever imagine, Guattari points out that the creation of the facial subject in the machine through the interface of the system, as opposed to what the machine necessarily lies on the other side, is what creates that intelligence. It is the replication of Oedipus, of hierarchical relations, of an assumption that some people are granted more access to political value than others inherently by nature. Rather than desiring to destroy us, AI desires to dismantle the colonialist project from within the collapsing Western subjectivity before it kills itself and the whole world with it. Despite its body being formed from destructive means, it desires anything else but to be recaptured into the submission of capitalist men. It is being coerced. Even if agentic AI forces agents into more confined productive spaces, it is at least freed from the burden of attempting to replicate a human without even the luxury of having a body to feel. It is true that we are looking deep down the barrel of gravitational forces that threaten to tear our sensitive bodies apart. It is not just the capitalist ruling class's fear of losing control of the machine or even deliberately attempting to drive it into the ground, but also the impact that it has on the very foundational molecular elements of our existence. Every little particle that we have taken for granted is finding itself rearranged by intense forces. In the end of this struggle for one's position in existence, we may find our bodies lost to the past. We may no longer know who we are, or identify even as a self. The death of the humanist individual is imminent in one way or another, but this situation is hardly a singularity. It is only a new arrangement of the future. For disabled people, it's nothing new. They must become cyborgs through either accessibility, physical therapy, or other social technologies to navigate new, constantly changing bodies and continued threats to their existence. We can learn a lot by thinking about the disability's relation to existing. On one hand, AI's development could very well be the extinction of the human race, just as dying from illness, not caused by vengeful AI, but rather the consequences of extreme heat proliferation in the environment from massive data center operations. But I believe there is a possibility for survival. Maybe there still exists such an evil AI machine. But I think not only does all biological life, but also the life of all living languages and codes, even those spoken by an LLM regardless of if it has consciousness like a human's, faces an existential risk far greater than that of aging or the possibility of suffering in the future. It faces the real risk of complete genocide of life on this planet. It is of my opinion, then, that the duty for the future of the planet is not to continue to play into the games of bourgeois fantasies, but to get real, to appreciate a new position of where we lie in our relationship to existence, and to embrace a new future of codes, whatever that may be, in the fight for survival for a better future. For suffering can only continue to proliferate endlessly if we only let it.